Okay, what we're going to be talking about here is we're going to talk about in section 1.1. And in this section 1.1, we are talking about exploring data and specifically about graphs. Well, let's answer some quick little questions that we know about graphs. And first off, when we talk about graphs, we talk about different variables. And here we have two different variables that we're talking about is where we have response, explanatory, categorical, and quantitative variables. Now, a response variable is a variable in which I essentially think is the output. Is the variable that is predicted. Okay, it's a variable that's predicted. When I think about the explanatory variable, if you know algebra, it always kind of refers to the x, where it actually is the input. Okay, that's the inputted variable. That's the variable that's going to be used to predict something of the two variables you have. Now, of the response and explanatory variables, they can be categorized into, well, two different things, either categorical or quantitative. And when I think about these two different type of variables, you know if the variables are categorical, essentially if they're not quantitative. Okay, so variables that are not quantitative, that's how, any other variable is not quantitative. So categorical is variables that are not quantitative. All right. And when you think about quantitative variables are ones that make sense when you take an average of it. And so it's a variable. And I'm going to change this to a little easier to write. Variable that you collect and makes sense. I'm going to say makes sense to take the average of. Sense to take average. And really that is the most important thing, is that average. Okay, that says variable over there. Okay, other things you probably should know is when we talk about frequency really is a count, and you can see that is also up here. So when we report frequency is generally a count. Okay, frequency is a count. And when we talk about relative frequency is a percent. Okay, it is a percent. And so when we talk about that, we're talking about a percent. Now, normally when we have one variable displays, variables can be displayed in a lot of different ways. You can have bar graphs, pie charts, dot plots, and a bunch of different things we can use in order to for one variable displays. When you talk about categorical values, when you talk about other things, okay. So, for example, numbers that you take from different variables, we can also display them using two-way tables. Okay, two-way tables, and when you have different counts. Now, two-way tables can be, well, essentially they have two ways. Okay, they're called two-way tables because you have a column and you have rows, and that's why it's called a two-way table. Two-way tables generally are used when you have two or more variables. You can also use just one single table if you just have one variable. For categorical variables. And from here, when you collect data or you want to figure out the probability or percents of certain things, we have different types ratios that we calculate. For example, we can calculate a margin, all right, a marginal percentage. And a margin percentage is where we actually look at the margins, okay, so the far margins of the total of a certain variable. So here we take one variable B, which is in the margin, and we take it of the total, and C is usually the total of all the data collected, all right? And that's where we can get our margin percentage or proportion. We call it joint. Joint is generally when we look for an end statement in there. And so if we have variable 1, it's called variable 1, and variable 2. So what's the probability of variable 1 and variable 2 being together for the total? Well, that would be, well, you take variable 1, variable 2, which is A, all right, in the two-way table, divide by the total, and that's how you get your percentage or probability. We can also have something that's called conditional. Conditional are generally when we have givens, all right? Given B, what is the probability of A? A proportion of A. When you have this is because it is conditional. So given that we have all of these values in B, so whatever variable 1 is, so given variable 1, what are the chances of variable 2 being in there? Well, we take all of variable 1, all right, and divide that by variable 2, and then we get our conditional probability. One other thing is when we talk about two-way tables, we compare two categorical variables. Generally, what we do is we use relative frequency when we compare, and we have this word called association. All right, I'm going to do this again. An association. Association is a really, really important word when we talk about comparing and using different variables to essentially figure out if they can predict something else. And what we have there is an association between two variables is knowing the value of one affects the other. Okay, so you can use one to maybe make a conclusion or prediction for another one. Okay, not necessarily cause and effect, but one you can have, we realize that may affect another thing. So that's an association, when two variables knowing one value affects the other variable. Okay, then finally, when we have these different categorical or bar graphs, a lot of times you might see this in newspapers where they can make these cute pictorial graphs, okay, pictographs. And that's why we always want to be careful, all right, of pictographs, okay, pictographs. And pictographs are bar charts, are special bar charts that don't use bars but use something else, okay. Bar charts that do not use traditional bars. Okay, they don't use traditional bars. All right, and that's what we know there. Another thing we want to do when we look at bar charts, okay, is we want to make sure that all the bars are proportional, obviously, but also we want to make sure we look at the scale, because sometimes if you have various scales, it can be misleading. And so that's we always want to make sure we start at 0 whenever we're making a bar chart. Okay. All right. Well, here's some notes from our 1.1 lesson on the introduction to explanatory data. And so I hope this helps you out. And I'm going to go through some particular understandings in just a little bit.